The first thing Daniel Reed saw when he turned into the driveway was smoke. Not smoke from the kitchen, not smoke from a neighbor's grill. A dark column of smoke was rising from the metal fire pit behind the house where he and his 2 children had been living for almost a year. Daniel stopped the car so suddenly that his 80-year-old daughter, Sophie, looked up from the book in her lap. "Dad." Daniel didn't answer. He was staring at the fire. His old winter coat was burning. Beside it was a cardboard box filled with family photographs, and sticking out from under another pile of flames was the blue blanket his late wife had wrapped around their son when he was born. Daniel's heart dropped. No. He threw open the car door. "Sophie, stay here with Noah." But 5-year-old Noah was already looking through the window. "Daddy, is that our stuff?" Daniel ran toward the backyard. Standing several feet from the fire was Margaret Hale, the owner of the property and the woman Daniel had worked for during the last 18 months. Her arms were folded across her expensive coat. 2 suitcases sat beside the driveway. Daniel stopped in front of her. "What are you doing?" Margaret didn't move. "I told you this morning. You're finished here. You said I was fired. You didn't say you were throwing my children out of the house. It's my property. We have a rental agreement." Margaret gave a small laugh. "You have a piece of paper." Daniel looked toward the fire again. "My wife's photographs are in there. You should have taken your things when you had the chance." For a few seconds, Daniel couldn't speak. His wife, Emily, had died 3 years earlier after a long illness. Almost every extra dollar Daniel had saved during their marriage had gone toward treatments, hospital visits, and keeping their family together. After Emily died, Daniel had been left with 2 young children, medical debt, and a silence in their apartment that was sometimes harder to face than the bills. He had once worked as a junior accountant for a large manufacturing company. After Emily became sick, he reduced his hours to care for her. After her death, he needed work that allowed him to collect Sophie from school and stay home when Noah was sick. That was how he had met Margaret. She owned Hale Property Services, a small but successful company that managed apartments, commercial buildings, and rental homes around the city. Daniel handled invoices, payroll records, and vendor payments. Margaret also owned the small house behind her company's main office. When she learned Daniel was struggling with rent, she offered it to him at a reduced price. "You work hard," she had told him. "Consider it part of your compensation." For Daniel, it had felt like a second chance. The house wasn't beautiful. The kitchen floor was cracked. The heating system made strange noises at night. But Sophie had her own bedroom. Noah had a tiny backyard where he could kick a soccer ball, and for the first time since Emily died, Daniel had started saving money again. 6 weeks earlier, Daniel noticed something unusual at work. Several payments were being made to maintenance companies he had never heard of. The invoices looked normal at first, but the addresses led to empty offices. The phone numbers didn't work. When Daniel compared the invoices with bank records, he found something worse. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been transferred to companies that appeared to exist only on paper. Daniel didn't accuse Margaret. He assumed there was an explanation. One afternoon, he carried a folder into her office. "I think we have an accounting problem." Margaret looked up. "What kind of problem?" "These vendors, I can't confirm that they actually performed the work." Her expression changed, only slightly, but Daniel noticed. "Leave the folder. I think we should have the accountant review." I said leave it. The following morning, Margaret told Daniel those vendors were confidential contractors and ordered him to stop asking questions. Daniel did, at least openly, but because his name appeared on several accounting records, he quietly made copies of documents that involved transactions he had processed. He wasn't trying to expose Margaret. He was protecting himself. Then that morning, Margaret had walked into his office carrying an envelope. "You're no longer needed." Daniel stared at her. "Why?" "Company restructuring. There are 4 months left on my employment agreement. I'll have my attorney deal with that." Daniel understood immediately. "This is because I asked about those invoices." Margaret leaned closer. "You have 2 children depending on you, Daniel." The words sounded like advice, but her tone felt like a warning. "Go home. Take care of your family. Forget about my company." Daniel had spent the afternoon applying for jobs at the public library because he no longer had access to his work computer. He expected to return home and tell his children that Dad had lost his job. He never expected to find their lives burning in the backyard. Now Sophie and Noah had climbed out of the car. Sophie stood frozen beside the driveway. Her eyes suddenly widened. "My memory box." Daniel turned toward her. "My box from Mom." She ran toward the fire. Daniel caught her before she reached it. "No, Sophie, my letters are in there." She struggled against his arms. "Dad, Mom's letters." "I know." "No, you don't." Tears rolled down her face. "She wrote them for me." Daniel held her tightly as she cried. Margaret looked away. Daniel had never hated anyone in his life. Not even now. But he felt something inside him change. He looked at Margaret. "You had no right. I gave you an opportunity." she replied. You decided to become a problem. Daniel lowered his voice. My children had nothing to do with your company. For the first time, Margaret had no answer. Daniel walked toward the suitcases only. Some clothes had been saved. Everything else had either been dumped beside the road or thrown into the fire. He called the police. An officer arrived 20 minutes later, photographed the damaged property, reviewed Daniel's rental agreement, and told Margaret she could not legally remove a tenant without proper procedure. Margaret called her attorney. The argument continued for nearly an hour. Daniel could have insisted on entering the house again, but Sophie was shaking. Noah was crying because his favorite stuffed bear was gone. Daniel looked at his children and realized something. Winning the argument tonight would not make them feel safe inside that house. He put the suitcases in the car. Where are we going? Noah whispered. Daniel forced a smile. We're going on a little adventure. Sophie knew better. Do we have a home? Daniel knelt beside her. Home is wherever you, Noah, and I are together. She stared at him. That sounds like something people say when they don't have a home. Daniel almost laughed. Instead, his eyes filled with tears. You're getting too smart. That night, they checked into a cheap motel near Sophie's school. There were 2 beds, a small table, and a refrigerator that made a loud buzzing sound. Daniel gave the children 1 bed. He sat in the chair. While they slept, he had $1,843 in his bank account. No job. No permanent home. And no idea what he would tell them in the morning. Then his phone rang. It was 11:47 p.m. The number belonged to Robert Chen, the outside accountant who occasionally reviewed Halley Property Services. Daniel almost ignored it. Instead, he answered. Daniel? Yes. Robert sounded tense. I need you to listen carefully. Do you still have copies of the Hale vendor records? Daniel looked toward the sleeping children. Some. Do not destroy them. Why? There was a long silence. Then Robert said something Daniel never expected. Because I think Margaret fired you after realizing you had discovered something much bigger than fake invoices. Daniel stepped quietly into the motel bathroom so he wouldn't wake Sophie and Noah. What did I discover? Robert lowered his voice. For months I'd been asking Margaret for supporting documents. She kept delaying. Today, after you were fired, someone from the bank contacted me about several unusual transactions. Daniel leaned against the sink. How unusual. Millions of dollars moved between company accounts, property accounts, and businesses connected to Margaret personally. Daniel felt sick. I processed some of those payments. I know. That's why you need the records. Daniel immediately understood the danger. If authorities investigated the company, his name could appear beside transactions he had never known were fraudulent. Robert continued. I'm contacting an attorney tomorrow. You should do the same. I can barely afford this motel. There may be legal aid available. But Daniel, do not speak to Margaret. Daniel looked into the cracked bathroom mirror. Hours earlier, his biggest fear had been finding another job. Now he was afraid his family could be dragged into someone else's crime the next morning. Daniel made pancakes for the children using a microwave and paper plates. Noah looked at the food. These are weird pancakes. They're luxury motel pancakes. They're floppy. Luxury means floppy. For the first time since the fire. Sophie smiled. It lasted only a second. Then she asked, are we going back? Daniel sat beside her. No, ever. I don't think so. She looked down at her plate. Daniel knew what she was thinking. The house had been the last place where she still kept things that reminded her of her mother. Emily had written Sophie several short letters during the final months of her illness. Some were for birthdays, some were just simple notes. One said, when you're scared, remember that being brave doesn't mean you aren't afraid. It means you keep going while you are afraid. Daniel had kept copies of some photographs, but not the handwritten letters. He thought they were gone forever. That afternoon, while the children were at school, Daniel met a legal aid attorney named Maya Torres. She listened without interrupting. She reviewed his employment papers, rental agreement, photographs from the fire, and accounting records. When she reached the vendor documents, she sat up. Where did you get these? They were part of my work. Did you alter anything? No. Did you ever knowingly approve a false invoice? No. Did Margaret ever tell you these companies were fake? No. She told me they were confidential contractors. Maya closed the folder. Then stop worrying about protecting Margaret. I'm worried about protecting myself. That's the same reason you need to tell the truth. Daniel hesitated. If I give these records to investigators, what happens? I don't know. Could she lose her company? Possibly her houses. Possibly. Daniel rubbed his face. Even after everything Margaret had done, he didn't want revenge. He just wanted his children safe. Maya seemed to understand. You're not deciding her punishment, Daniel. You're deciding whether to be honest about what you saw. That sentence stayed with him the next day. Daniel agreed to speak with investigators from the State Financial Crimes Unit. He explained every payment he had processed. He showed them emails. He explained how Margaret had ordered him to stop asking questions. He also gave them the copies of the suspicious invoices. Then he went back to the motel and waited. Nothing happened. Immediately, real life rarely moves as quickly as people expect. Daniel still needed work. He still needed somewhere to live. He sent out 37 applications in 12 days. Most companies never responded to rejected him after interviews. One offered him a job, but the hours ended at 7 each evening. "I can't do that," Daniel told the recruiter. "You said you needed work." "I do." "Then what's the problem? My kids finish school at 3. Can someone else collect them?" Daniel thought about Emily. No. He turned down the job. That night, after the children were asleep, Daniel sat on the motel floor and cried quietly. It wasn't because he regretted choosing his children, it was because he was tired of every responsible choice costing him something. 3 weeks passed. The motel bill consumed most of his savings eventually. Daniel moved the family into a temporary housing program, run by a local church and community center. They were given a small apartment for 6 weeks. Sophie hated telling friends she couldn't invite them over. Noah started asking every night, "Are we moving tomorrow?" Daniel always answered, "Not tomorrow," because it was the only promise he could safely make. Then one afternoon, Maya called. "The investigators found the companies from your records." Daniel held his breath. And they weren't maintenance companies. What were they? Shell businesses controlled by Margaret and 2 associates. Investigators believe company money and investor funds were moved through them. Daniel sat down. How much? Enough that a prosecutor has asked a judge to temporarily freeze the assets connected to the investigation. Daniel thought of the title deeds he had seen. The rental buildings, the company accounts, Margaret's investment properties. What does that mean? It means she won't be able to sell, transfer, or hide certain assets while the case is investigated. Certain assets, Maya paused. The order is broad. Daniel, bank accounts, several properties, investment accounts, and the company itself are covered. Daniel said nothing. Margaret had burned nearly everything he owned because she thought he was powerless. Now she couldn't move her own money, but Daniel didn't feel happy. He looked around the tiny temporary apartment. His children were still sleeping on borrowed beds. Frozen bank accounts weren't going to give Sophie her mother's letters back. That evening, someone knocked on the apartment door. Daniel opened it. A young man stood outside holding a damaged plastic storage box. "Are you Daniel Reed?" "Yes. I'm Jason. I used to do maintenance for Margaret." Daniel recognized him. "What are you doing here?" Jason placed the box on the floor. "I was there the day she put your stuff outside." Daniel stared at him. "I left before the police came." "Okay." Jason looked ashamed. "She told me to throw everything into the fire." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I didn't." "What?" "Not all of it." Jason opened the damaged box. Inside were several smoke-stained photographs, a toy car, a small jewelry case, and a purple notebook. Daniel stopped breathing. Sophie's memory box. Jason explained that he had moved some belongings behind the maintenance shed before Margaret noticed. "When I heard about the investigation, I figured you should get them back." Daniel lifted the purple notebook carefully. Some pages were damaged, but inside were 4 envelopes. Emily's handwriting was still visible. Daniel covered his mouth for several seconds. He couldn't speak. That afternoon, Sophie came home from school and found the box on the table. She froze. "Dad." Daniel held out the first envelope. Her name was written across the front. Sophie took it with both hands. "Is this?" "Yes." She pressed the letter against her chest. Then she began crying. Not loudly, just quiet tears from a child who had been trying far too hard to act older than she was. Daniel knelt and wrapped his arms around her. "I thought she was gone again," Sophie whispered. Daniel's face tightened. "So did I." Noah climbed into their arms without understanding everything, only knowing his family needed him. The 3 of them sat on the floor together. Sophie opened the letter. She read silently for a moment, then she stopped. "What does it say?" Daniel asked. Sophie looked up at him. "Mom said if things ever get hard, I should look after you because you pretend you're okay when you're not." Daniel laughed through his tears. "That sounds like your mother." Sophie touched his cheek. "Dad." "Yeah, you don't have to pretend with us." And after weeks of trying to be strong for everyone else, Daniel finally lowered his head onto his daughter's shoulder and cried. The asset freeze made headlines 2 days later. Margaret Hale was not convicted of anything at that stage. The court order was temporary, meant to stop money and property connected to the investigation from being moved while authorities examined the records. Daniel was careful to explain that to Sophie. "Does that mean she's going to jail?" she asked. "I don't know. Are you happy she lost everything?" Daniel thought carefully. "She hasn't lost everything, but her money is frozen for now." Sophie waited. Daniel finally said, "And no, I'm not happy after what she did. What she did was wrong. But if we become happy when someone else suffers, then we're letting them change who we are." Sophie considered this, so we don't forgive her. Forgiveness and trust are different things. That answer seemed to make sense to her. The investigation continued for months. Other employees were interviewed. Investors came forward. Records that showed that Margaret and 2 business partners had been moving money between accounts for years while hiding losses and inflating property values. Daniel's records became one small but important part of a much larger case. His biggest relief came when investigators formally confirmed he was considered a cooperating witness, not a suspect. For the first time in weeks, he slept through the night, but his life still needed Rebuilding. A courtroom could freeze Margaret's property. It could not magically solve Daniel's problems. He still needed a job. One morning, Robert Chen called him. I heard you're still looking. My firm needs someone in compliance. Accounting. Daniel laughed. I think I've had enough questionable invoices for one lifetime. That's exactly why I'm calling. Robert explained that his firm helped small companies organize records and detect financial problems before they became serious. The pay was slightly better than Daniel's previous salary. But Daniel immediately asked the question that mattered most. What are the hours? 8:30 to 4. Daniel was silent. Robert added, and 2 days a week can be remote. When do I start? Robert laughed. Monday. Daniel's first paycheck did not change their life overnight. The second didn't either. He paid the motel debt. He rebuilt his emergency savings. He bought Noah a new stuffed bear. Although Noah insisted the replacement, you should have the same name as the old one. Then Daniel found a small 2-bedroom apartment 12 minutes from Sophie's school. The walls were plain, the living room was tiny, there was no backyard. But the lease was in Daniel's name. The first evening after moving in, they ate pizza while sitting on unopened boxes. Sophie looked around. Can we stay here? For as long as we pay the rent and follow the lease. Nobody can just throw us out. Not legally. Noah raised his slice of pizza. Too legally. Daniel and Sophie burst out laughing. Too legally, Daniel said, tapping his pizza against Noah's. Over the next several months, life slowly became normal again. Daniel helped with homework. He learned how to braid Sophie's hair badly enough that she eventually learned to do it herself. He packed Noah's lunches. He worked. He worried about bills. Sometimes he burned dinner. Sometimes the children argued. Sometimes he missed Emily so badly that he sat alone in the kitchen after midnight and listened to an old voicemail just to hear her voice. There was no miracle. There was simply progress. Then, nearly a year after the fire, Daniel was asked to attend a hearing connected to the financial case. Margaret was there. It was the first time I had seen her since the night she threw his family out. She looked different, not ruined, not broken, just tired. Her attorney spoke with prosecutors while Daniel waited across the hallway. Eventually, Margaret walked toward him. Maya moved closer to Daniel, but he quietly told her he was fine. Margaret stopped several feet away. I suppose you're pleased. Daniel looked at her. With what? You know exactly what. The investigation, my company, my properties, everything. Daniel shook his head. I didn't freeze your assets. You gave them the records. I told the truth about the records. You destroyed everything I built. Daniel stared at her for a long moment. Then he remembered the flames, Sophie screaming about her, mother's letters. Noah asking whether they still had a home. Daniel could have said something cruel a year earlier. He probably would have wanted to. Instead, he said quietly, Margaret, I came to you first. She didn't respond. I brought the invoices into your office because I thought there was a mistake. You could have explained them. You could have corrected whatever was happening. Instead, you threatened me, fired me, burned my family's belongings, and tried to make me afraid. Margaret looked toward the floor. Daniel continued. I didn't take your company from you. He paused. Your choices did. For the first time, Margaret seemed to have nothing to say. Daniel walked away. He never learned every detail of what happened inside Margaret's heart. He didn't need to. Several months later, the case was resolved through a combination of guilty pleas and financial settlements involving Margaret and her associates. Money recovered from frozen accounts was used, in part, to repay investors and other people who had suffered losses. Daniel also received compensation through a separate civil settlement for the illegal eviction, destroyed belongings, unpaid wages, and employment retaliation. It wasn't millions. It wasn't enough to make him rich, but it was enough to clear the remaining medical debt from Emily's illness and put a small amount into savings. For Sophie and Noah. Daniel used one part of the settlement for something else. He bought 3 fireproof document boxes. When Sophie saw them, she laughed. 3. One for important papers. He pointed to the second. One for photographs, and the third. Daniel handed it to her. For anything from Mom. Sophie carefully placed Emily's recovered letters inside. Then she added something Daniel hadn't seen before, a folded piece of paper. What's that? A letter to who? You. Daniel smiled. Can I read it? Not yet. When you really need it. Daniel shook his head. You're becoming exactly like your mother. That's good. It's very good. That night, after the children went to sleep, Daniel stood in the doorway of their rooms. Noah had kicked off his blanket. Sophie had fallen asleep with a book beside her. A year earlier, Daniel had sat in a motel chair, wondering whether he had failed them now. He'd understood something he hadn't understood then. Being a good father was not about preventing every bad thing from reaching his children he couldn't control, every cruel person he couldn't guarantee financial security. He couldn't make sure they never lost anything. Being a father meant showing them what to do when life knocked them down. Protect what matters, tell the truth, accept help when you need it. Keep your heart soft without allowing people to walk over you. And get up again Daniel walked into Sophie's room and pulled the blanket over her shoulders, half asleep. She whispered, "Dad, I'm here. You okay?" Daniel smiled. This time he didn't pretend. Yeah, he looked around their little apartment. "I think I finally am